this will be further, way further into the frontier. Like, I've made leaps in this book that go, I would say, far beyond what I managed in Maps of Meaning.
You're writing a book, We Who Wrestle With God, and I guess this ties back to my earlier question, and the note you wrote in Maps of Meaning to your father, saying you're struggling to articulate these ideas. And in the 23 years that have gone since Maps of Meaning, do you feel like you're closer to articulating those ideas? And is this...
Well, I'm practicing that all the time. You know, each of the lectures is an opportunity to push that capacity to articulate a little further, to make it a little more differentiated, to make it a little more accessible, to make it clearer. And it's an unfolding, right? Because the ideas, well, first of all, they're not my ideas, but the ideas were implicit, and then they unfold, right? Maybe they unfold first of all in revelation, and then they unfold in art, and then they unfold in narrative, and then they unfold in philosophy, and then they unfold in apprehensible public speech. It's something like that, and it's a constant unfolding. And so, you know, I'm on the edge of my ability to do that unfolding, and that's the edge that I occupy. And I think the reason that my lectures are successful, they're not really lectures, they're conversations with the crowd in some real sense. But the reason they're successful is because they offer people an opportunity to participate in the process of that unfolding. Because it's not only unfolding for me in some sense, it's unfolding for those with whom I'm communicating at the same time. And the lectures, the public events, are a place for that to happen. You know, it's the same thing in some real sense that you're doing when you're playing your music. You know, you're having an idea is unfolding.
You feel the energy, and you see what resonates, and
you see what resonates.
It's a conversation.
Right. And you know, when a concert goes great, the audience is the same place you are, and everyone is doing the same thing. It's a form of collective worship, fundamentally, and celebration. And celebration of what? Well, it's the unfolding of an artistic vision, obviously, because that's what you're doing on stage. And there's an improvisational element to that, which is why people like live concerts, and a participatory element. And I would say the same thing applies to my public engagements. And it's demanding, but it's extremely engaging, you know, very.
So We Who Wrestle With God, then, will that be a distillation of your public speaking in a book?
And the advantage to a book is that you can it's really rigorous. And so it's a distillation. That's a good way of thinking about it. It's a further development of the ideas that I developed in Maps of Meaning and then unfolded in my last two books. And this will be way further into the frontier. Like, I've made leaps in this book that go, I would say, far beyond what I managed in Maps of Meaning. There's much more original thought in this book than there is in 12 Rules or Beyond Order. Because those books were really popularizations, in some sense, of the concepts that I developed in Maps of Meaning. And I was able to make them more apprehensible because I spent 20 years lecturing about Maps of Meaning. And so I learned how to communicate the ideas in a manner that was grippable. But with this new book, We Who Wrestle With God, I have a cardinal idea that it's a revolutionary idea. Now, it's not my idea in the same sense we've already been talking about. It's the unfolding of something that's been implicit, but I think I've unfolded it another layer. It's very exciting. So I can give you like an overview in some sense. Well, you act out a story. And not only do you act out a story, but you perceive the world through a story. And so then the question is, well, what story should you act out? And so then you might think of that as, what story should you emulate? Or you might think about it as, what story should you imitate? Now, there's hints of that in doctrines like the imitation of Christ, let's say. But anyways, what should you imitate? Well, you should imitate that which is the highest. Well, is that a description of the objective world? It's like, no, because you can't imitate the objective world. Not obviously. It's complicated, but not obviously. You imitate something like a spirit, right? Which is a pattern of behavior. That's a way of thinking about a spirit. It's a pattern of behavior. So you might say, well, if you're in a concert, the whole audience is animated by a spirit. It's the spirit of music, whatever that spirit is. And it inhabits everybody simultaneously. And it's obviously a pattern because everyone's moving the same way. It's a pattern, right? And they're synced physiologically, like the band is synced together physiologically. And there's something moving about that, literally, because it moves you. Well, there's a pattern that you should emulate. It's a pattern of character. And the stories about God in the biblical corpus are representations of the pattern to emulate. They're not a description of the structure of the objective world. They're not proto-scientific theories. They're an embodied ethos. And it's very complex ethos, because you might say, well, who should you be? Well, you can't sum it up in a sentence, because life is too complicated to sum up in a sentence. You could say, love your neighbor as thyself, if you had to sum it up in a sentence. But still, that has to be unpacked. God is presented in the biblical corpus as a character, and as a character that calls to emulate. I'll give you a couple of examples. So, for example, in the story of Noah, God is presented as the spirit that calls to the wise in times of trouble to prepare. You might say, well, do you believe in God? It's like, well, do you let that spirit guide you? Well, you do if you're wise and awake. Do you believe? Well, it depends on what you mean by believe. If you follow the spirit that calls you when you're wise to prepare in times of crisis, then you believe in the most fundamental sense, because you act it out and you see the world. Well, and then God is represented as a character with multiple dimensions. And each story is a representation of a dimension. So another example, in the Abraham story, which is a very fundamental story, God is represented as the spirit that calls the overly dependent and secure to the adventure of their lives. So do you believe in that? It's like, well, do you leave your place of security and have the adventure of your life? Yes or no? No, then you don't believe. Yes, then you follow that spirit. That's the belief, is the following. It's not a propositional statement. It's the following. Then in the story of Exodus, God is the spirit that calls those who labor under tyranny to shoulder the burden and responsibility of their autonomy. It's like, do you believe in that? Well, figure that out for yourself. It's like, do you think slavery is wrong? Well, of course it's wrong. It's obvious that it's wrong. It's like, yeah, well, there's a reason it's obvious, and it isn't because you figured it out. And it wasn't obvious to many people throughout the vastest spans of history. In fact, quite the opposite was obvious. It's like, if I can make you do what I want, why don't I have the right to do that? Or why isn't that even the definition of right? It's like, that's a really hard question. And modern people, and I would say that's particularly true of people on the left, they just recoil it. It's obvious that slavery is wrong. It's like, really? It's that obvious, is it? Why did it take us until like 500 years ago to figure that out then, if it's so obvious? And so part of this book is an investigation into the character of God, so to speak, and viewed not entirely through the lens of the biblical corpus, but to a large degree. And it's an investigation. The title, We Who Wrestle With God, that's what Israel means. The word Israel means we who wrestle with God, which is really something, because Israel, the people of Israel are God's chosen people. And what that implies at a narrative level is that if you wrestle with God, you're one of the chosen people. And everyone wrestles with God, whether they know it or not. And that's true even more for atheists than for most religious people, because they spend almost all their time wrestling with God. They wouldn't proclaim themselves as atheists otherwise. They'd be off, chasing girls or something, which probably is what they should be doing.
At the end of Demons, Dostoevsky talks about it's better to be off the fence, not believing in God, than on the fence, as an agnostic.
And you see that in the book of Revelation too, because Christ says very straightforwardly in the vision of Christ is accompanied by the sentiment that those who sit on the fence are those who will be subject to the harshest judgment.